is part of the smart grid. But if we converted every car that we drive today to gasoline, we would need to double electrical production. So it's not a magic bullet. You know, we're going to have enough trouble greening our grid, but we could. We could. And so one of the questions we want to ask is, are we going to go biofuels or electrons? What scales up? Biofuels are like pumping fuel from a canola field or a soybean field, or, you know. But we don't have enough arable land to do this. Richard Branson famously flew a plane on 1/2 coconut oil, and someone immediately pointed out there's not enough coconuts in the world to feed half of Heathrow. So the constraint on biofuel is that we simply don't have enough land mass. So going to cellulosic ethanol certainly helps. Third generation biofuels certainly help. But unless we're going to do something really radical, like irrigate the desert with salt water and grow halophytes, which are saltwater loving plants, we're not going to solve the problem. We could. Goddard Space Center has extended some of their calculations, and if we spent $2 trillion, we could irrigate enough desert and build enough capacity to replace the entire world's oil supply. Are we going to do that? Probably not, but we could. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to electrify the grid. And this is what they have on the books in Europe. This is what a smart grid looks like. And essentially, it's an energy-managed, continent-wide set of renewable resources. These are massive solar thermal plants. Each one of them are around 1 gigawatt that are going to be installed in northern Africa. Everything's connected together by high-voltage DC lines. There's wind farms onshore, offshore. That's really what you need to think about when you think about kicking the fossil fuel habit, right? That's the scale that we need to build out, and that's the only way that renewables become reliable enough to keep the factories humming. Multiple sources from multiple geographies, all on the grid and all contributing together. There isn't something like this yet planned for North America, but this is the way that we need to go if we're going to kick the habit. And that's the scale to think about when you think about kicking the habit, right? It's not a wind farm. It's wind farms spread across the continent, backed up by tidal, backed up by big solar thermal, backed up by big solar PV, biomass plants, geothermal plants. They all contribute together, and that's how we green the grid, and that's how we get away from the constraints on biofuels, and that's how we kick the fossil fuel habit. So that is the image that you should keep in mind when you think about renewable energy, right? That's how it works. So very quickly, now these are all in the book, so I'm going to whip through these. But these are examples of plants that exist today that are producing energy on the scale that a coal plant can produce energy. So there are solar thermal plants. This is Morgan Solar's panels, by the way. But there are solar thermal plants that use the heat of the sun, parabolic dish, or else they aim it at a tower in the center using mirrors. These plants can produce power 24 hours a day because you use molten salt as your working fluid, and you store it in a giant thermos and you open it at night. Of course, you don't need to run all day. You need to just shift the peak to when it's useful. But the point is, we can build solar thermal plants that are near gigawatt in size that can produce baseload power. Is there enough sun? There's enough sun to power the entire planet on a piece of the Sahara. If the Sahara was this big, the size of my thumb, could, at today's technology and today's efficiencies, produce enough electrical power to supply our entire primary energy needs. You need to distribute it and all that kind of stuff. But the point is, the amount of energy available to any one of these sources, geothermal, enhanced geothermal, I'll explain in a second, wind, is absolutely stupendous. It's not toy sizes, and it competes with fossil fuels in terms of the amount that it can produce. So that's an existing solar plant in Grenada, Spain. Wind, we know what wind is, big offshore farms, big onshore farms. And wind, by the way, gets reliable, not single wind farms. Wind is only reliable when you have it spread across different weather patterns. Right? There's been a study out of Basel, Germany that showed they could get 70% of Europe's power from wind farms if they had them spaced intelligently apart. And when one is not blowing, the other one is. Right? So it's not true the wind doesn't always blow. It's just not always blowing in the same place. And it blows pretty regularly because we know what makes the wind blow. It's the sun heating the air, and the air expands, which happens pretty regularly. So wind is much more reliable than is thought, because single wind farms are not reliable. It's true. But you need to distribute them. The big game changer, so in geothermal I've mentioned a bit. I have this in my hotel. Very effective, reduces the energy load in a building by roughly 50 to 60%. But the game changer, this is my hotel where it's being drilled, the game changer is not regular geothermal where you're tapping hot liquid that's near the surface. It's called enhanced geothermal. So enhanced geothermal is the one technology that we're not looking at here in North America. They're doing it big time in Australia, with some projects in Germany and France. But we've got the expertise here. So what you do is you just drill 2 holes, and if you drill deep enough, maybe 8 kilometers down, you hit very hot, very dry rock. You fracture that rock, which we do all the time when we go after shale gas, for example, so this is nothing new. You fracture the rock and you move a liquid through it and you extract the heat from that rock and produce electricity. And a report from MIT that came out in 2006 talked about the amount of the primary resource that's available. And after reducing it to an engineering number, so you don't take the theoretical heat content, you take into account how much land you could do it on, you take into account energy conversion rates, yada, yada, yada. There's 30,000 times our primary energy needs in enhanced geothermal sitting beneath our feet in the United States. So if you include Canada, it's probably something like 60,000 times North America's needs. 24/7, 365 days a year power. So the question that we need to ask is, what kind of economic incentives do we need to put into the marketplace to have the BPs of the world, who can drill in deep water, 7 kilometers down to get little tiny pockets of oil, how do we move that expertise over to enhanced geothermal? We need to send market signals to do that, and there are ways to do that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But again, the point I'm making is, when you think about clean energy, don't think about little panels, and don't think about it in terms of, it's a toy. These are massive sources of energy that swamp what we have available to us in terms of a legacy of hydrocarbons in the ground. There are enormous plants that can produce power reliably. The decision we have is, how is it that we embrace these technologies, and how is it that we usher them into the marketplace quickly? That's an operating enhanced geothermal plant in Cooper's Basin, Australia. So I'm going to quickly go through this. We know what hydro is. Ocean power, I have no faith in. I think wave power is far too technically risky. There's not enough there to motivate engineers to solve the problem at scale. Tidal power, I think, is great in some regions, but it's not going to move the needle globally. There's just not enough of it. The energy internet, I've mentioned a bit briefly. I'm going over this quickly because I want to give a chance for some Q&A, and this is all in the book, so I don't mean to go ride roughshod over this. But the one missing piece, I think, of the energy internet, which is roughly 3 different kinds of grid. One is continent-wide, which balances one wind farm against another and one type against another. The other is regional, so it's distributed power. So it's not just a giant coal plant sending power one way. All the wires are 2-way, so you can produce power anywhere. Those are 2 kinds of grid that makes up a smart grid. The third is demand response, which we know you can turn down demand instead of putting on new supply. But what's missing is storage. And I think this represents a massive opportunity for people who can crack it. The only grid-sized storage we have now is pumped hydro. You pump water up a hill, and then you use it in a traditional way to grab the energy back. There are some companies at Mars that are working on storage. There's underwater compressed air. There's a zinc manganese battery. There's a low-friction flywheel. The challenge is there's not an economic incentive to put storage on the grid yet, because we don't need grid-level storage until we get to 30 or 40% renewables. But when that happens, it's a massive global opportunity. So California's response is to simply legislate, and they're going to legislate storage onto the grid to create a marketplace, which will get all of the people who want to build large prototypes of grid-scale storage doing it down in California, so they're all set up there when this demand hits, which will probably be 5 or 6 years from now. So storage is a very interesting question, and people who can solve that nut will have a very big global market, in my view. Of course, I'm not going to get into technicalities of storage, but you don't need to store that much, right? This is a typical solar farm. All you need to do is shift the peak of when you have your peak power from the sun to when the peak power is on the grid, which is only 3 or 4 hours, maybe 4 hours difference. So you store that much energy, which is the red curve is the energy you're producing. The blue is the energy that you need on the grid. So you store that much and release it there with that much power. So storage doesn't need to be capable of delivering power 24 hours a day. It just needs to manage power and store it for roughly 6 to 8 hours. And technologies that can do that can make renewables capable of delivering baseload power. So hurdles to scale, there are many. The first is that we have an infrastructure that seems to work perfectly well. Unless you're a climate geek and you've opened the door into the kitchen of carbon and you're scared silly, as I am, as scientists are, you don't care. The lights work, the factories work, what's the problem? It's cheap, there's lots of coal, I don't see a problem. And we've put a lot of capital investment in that infrastructure, right? We can talk about putting incrementally green electrons on the grid and putting electric cars out. We've got a massive infrastructure we've already got, and we need to figure out a way to actually turn that off before the cycle time, before those plants outlive their